A very good evening to you all. Today we are going to discuss the first farmers of Deccan or Western Deccan or largely the state of Maharashtra. And we are going to revisit their story, the story of how Deccan was settled. I can see lots of my friends and teachers and colleagues here, but I'm aware there might be people who are not from archaeology who will also might be joining here. So I will try to keep my jargon to the minimal and try to explain things in a more layperson's language. So today, we start with a story. I'm saying is this revisiting the story. It's the story of how Deccan was settled, but that also starts with a story. It's the story of how Deccan Chalcolithic, the whole phenomenon, of investigations of Deccan Chalcolithic started. The story of its discovery of its first site, Jorve. The year was 1947. India was standing on the cusp of getting its independence, on the eve of its independence. The monsoons, the famous monsoons of India, that year they rained so hard that a very small village, nondescript village near Nasik called Jorve on the river Pravara got flooded. Their fields also got flooded, and therefore the people, the villagers, they were pushed to the slopes of the village. They rebuilt their houses and they started cultivating the lands on the higher slopes. And when they started cultivating, they started finding very beautiful black painted red pottery which nobody had ever seen. And therefore it became quite a local sensation. The village had from Mahabharata. So you know how every village in India has a history. And thus the news caught wildfire. People who used to come to Zorweg also got interested in this. One of these people were a very young person called Shankar Sai. He was a clerk in around 20 years old of a local credit cooperative society. He got very interested and he collected these potsherds or pieces of pottery and published them in a local newspaper called Dainik Bharat, writing about the oral history of the village and how they are finding all these things. But he was a wise man. He knew there is a person called Dr. H.D. Sankalia who has taken up the reins of archaeology department in Pune. And thus he went to Dr. Sankalia and showed him the kind of findings that he was getting in this village. Sankalia got interested. He was planning to excavate Nasik, nearby a great center of religious significance in Maharashtra. And then he also included Jorve in the excavations. Till then, the history of Maharashtra was known about Satavahan. The earliest we knew about Satavahanas, and then we knew some of the Paleolithic tools that we were finding. We did not know what happened in between. There were some hazy descriptions from Puranas about how Shaka, Naga, Abhiras, Kulas came and populated the land, but we didn't know much about it. When they started excavating Jorve, they realized they are digging into a rural culture which does not know iron. However, this was a time before the invention of the discovery of C14 dating, so they did not have any dates. It was only when they excavated Nasik and they found the similar cultural levels below Satavahanas, they realized that this rural culture, which was unaware of iron technology, was actually a Chalcolithic culture. It was the first non-Harappan Chalcolithic culture known in India, discovered in India. And that opened the floodgates of the Chalcolithic discoveries in the Indian mainland subcontinent. And thus, Jorve became one of the most important and oft-remembered site in the saga of the first farmers of the Deccan. I'm just trying. There is some problem with the laptop PowerPoint and it is not working. I'll just try it and okay, it should work now. Okay, yes. Chalcolithic is the word which means the people who are using copper and stone technology. They do not know the advent of iron technology. And we see that there was an emergence of Chalcolithic communities in the mainland India along with the Harappan civilization or just after the Harappan civilization. These are especially in the western, central, and Deccan parts of India. You see there is a kind of contagious cultures which can be called as techno-complex, in what David Clark says, techno-complex, which are kind of similar cultures with polythetic range of materials. Okay. However, the Chalcolithic word was used first by Wheeler in his Brahmagiri report, where he is saying that these probably rolled shards are Chalcolithic in nature, but he could not really identify the hello. Sorry, there is some technical problem. I'll just get back to you in a minute. Yes. Okay. Okay. Thanks. So we see that there is a kind of emergence of all these protohistoric Chalcolithic cultures, which were often the first farmers of those regions. And there is Chalcolithic here. However, South India did not have Chalcolithic cultures. However, we come back to Deccan Chalcolithic. In 1947, the Jorve was discovered and Chalcolithic discovery started taking place with excavations at Nasik and Jorve. In 1955 to 1970, you see a lot of many small Chalcolithic sites that are being discovered across the whole Deccan. Okay, these are basically kind of these discoveries and small-scale excavations were fulfilling the cultural historical aim of obtaining information about when and where, like when did they exist, what are cultural phases about it, and what is the cultural chronology. It was meticulously being built. And then came discovery of a very big site, almost 30 hectares in size, and that site was called as Daimabad. And that site was eventually excavated twice or thrice. The last excavation being the biggest one and giving us the most productive report. We go back to the story of discovery of Jorve for a moment here now. Remember the clerk who discovered this and wrote it in the Dainik Bharat. Well, that person got interested in archaeology. He left his job. He took further education. He enrolled himself for further education. He did his MA, PhD from Deccan College. He joined Archaeological Survey of India and ended up excavating this biggest site of Deccan Chalcolithic, and his name was Shankar Annaji Sali. Sali was he has been one of the most respected names in annals of archaeology of Deccan and Maharashtra. Well, so excavations of Daimabad start. At the same time, we see something very interesting. Probably the first ever problem-oriented region-specific survey in Indian Chalcolithic takes place in context of Deccan Chalcolithic. M.N. Deshpande, from his Bijapur circle, he initiated a small survey focusing on the lower reaches of Bhima, especially Indi Taluka in Bijapur district. It was carried out by A. Sundara to understand the connections between South Indian Neolithic and Deccan Chalcolithic. Well, they documented more than 21 sites. They also documented a new form of pottery which was not really understood till excavations of Inamgaon took place. And they also documented a different ceramic industries apart from these plain Jorve ware. They also documented black and red ware. And the significance was apparent only after 1980s when we excavated Inamgaon. And then 1960s and 80s, one also sees, apart from all these small sites being discovered and being reported in Indian archaeological reviews, we see major surveys in Middle Tapi Valley, both by S.S. Sali and V.S. Shinde, and both surveys proved very exceptionally important for the construction of settlement pattern distribution that we know today, because it gave us a kind of a varied responses of sites to the environment like Tapi Valley, which is different than Godavari and Bhima Valley excavations. And then in 1968 came the discovery of Inamgaon, a small village which was a single culture mound, and the excavations, these were the watershed moments, not only for the history of Deccan Chalcolithic, but also in the history of Indian proto-history as such. The excavations were truly multidisciplinary in nature, working for almost 30 years, 25, 30 years in Deccan Chalcolithic. Now Deccan College had built up a kind of consistent avenues of inquiries into the archaeological record of Deccan Chalcolithic, and they kind of culminated in Inamgaon with the research strategies involving the scientific analysis that could be done, so that changed the data retrieval strategies. They also started classification of data, which was evident in Navratoli excavation, but it was kind of totally adopted here, where the classification of data according to the structures, okay, and removing the box. So that kind of gave us more access to the household archaeology. And the report was published in 1988, which is still known as one of the best ever excavation reports in the history of Indian archaeology. So Inamgaon was kind of a watershed in Deccan Chalcolithic archaeology. It also hypothesized about its end phase, which we will discuss later. But it kind of was taken as a definitive statement about what Deccan Chalcolithic is about. Okay, and we know that is never so in archaeology. There are no final conclusions. There is a robust body of research even after Inamgaon, which is generally not discussed when one reads about Inamgaon, because the most celebrated book, The First Farmers of Deccan by Professor M.K. Dhaulikar, is based essentially on evidence from Inamgaon and up till archaeological excavations up till Inamgaon. There are two domains in which this post-Inamgaon research in Deccan Chalcolithic has taken place. One is archaeology as such, and second is bioarchaeology. In archaeology, there is Sheena Panja, who has done a critique of the methodologies and inferences that Inamgaon excavation report employed. Second is Sheila Naik and Sheila Mishra, who did a small but very intensive and useful survey documenting hence undocumented sites of Late Jorme, small sites from the upper Bhima Valley. And then my work, where I have documented middle Bhima Valley, trying to document, then I have documented quite a few Late Jorve and early Jorve sites. So that is about archaeology. And then you have, based on the excavated remains from Inamgaon, you have a thesis coming from Seema Pavankar, very, very seminal contribution to archaeozoology, which also changed some of the conclusions mentioned earlier in the Inamgaon report. Then there are skeletal remains have been used by three set of researchers, that is Vadim Ben, John Lucas, Teresa Razek, and Gwen Robbins, who have worked on it consistently, and they have their biodemographic models based on it, especially centered on the Late Jorve changes in the population dynamics. Okay, so in brief, this is the history of Deccan Chalcolithic researches, and now we go to the actual Deccan Chalcolithic, how the first farmers who existed in Western Deccan, largely the state of Maharashtra barring the Konkan coast, and how did they live. So the time span is quite long, almost 1600 years, say 2450 BCE to 900 BCE. So imagine from Gupta age to modern today's. Okay, that is the kind of time span that for such long they existed. The geographical extent, if we see that they are the sites are documented from western and some parts of central Maharashtra and North Karnataka, not in Konkan, but in the valleys of Tapi, Godavari, Bhima, and Krishna river systems. River systems means not only the rivers actual, but their tributaries, the interflows, the lands in between, etc. There is a definite lack of survey in central Maharashtra and some parts of South Maharashtra. So we really do not know the whole situation. This is the geographical extent we are speaking about. This is only based on the available surveys. Even then, we know above 150, almost 200 sites are known. And the principal excavated sites are Inamgaon, Daimabad, Walki, and Prakash. There are quite a few small-scale excavations in all the three valleys, river systems, Tapi, Godavari, and Bhima. And they have given us, although being small, they have contributed a lot for our understanding of the past life ways. So this is a map. You can see here is the site of Prakash. Here is the Dhule district. Here is Nevasa and here is Daimabad. Okay, Nevasa is also an important site. So Nevasa, Paithan, Nasik all have Chalcolithic beginnings. And then here is the site of Inamgaon and Walki. This is from here to Pune. These are in Ahmednagar area, the core zone of Femin area of Deccan. And then you see there is a small cluster here of all these small sites documented by A. Sundara. These are the principal excavated sites of Deccan Chalcolithic. You have Prakash, Savalda, Bahurupa, Tekoda Bahar, which is a joint site, one being a cemetery and one is a residential site. One Kauthe, Daimabad, Nevasa, Apegao. Apegao is of the Saint Jnaneshwar, the same Apegao. Chandoli, Inamgaon, Walki, and Songaon. Songaon was excavated by Dev. These have been excavated by Professor S.B. Dev, M.K. Dhaulikar, Z.D. Ansari. Then there is Bhima Koregaon. There is a small site which is not shown here. It was excavated by prehistorian Dr. Khatri. Okay, and M.N. Deshpande. So there are quite a big who's who, all the who's who of Deccan archaeology have taken interest in Deccan Chalcolithic. And then we will see some photographs of the sites. These are the sprawling mounds of Inamgaon. This is a huge mound of Daimabad. If you see this red line, there is a person standing here. It's not very visible photo, clear photo. So I have shown so you can understand how big the mound is. Inamgaon and Daimabad are both single culture mounds. You do not have any later phase settlements there or any earlier settlements. There were only Chalcolithic settlements there. And then you see the site of Prakash. Then you see the site of Prakash. Okay, so now you see this is a multicultural site situated in North Maharashtra, North Deccan. You see how huge it is. This site has an uninterrupted sequence from prehistory to almost modern. This was an important site even in the Maratha period and Maratha logistics of political logistics. This is an virtually unknown site called Vite or Ite, as reported by K.R. Kapre, who has done a very seminal thesis on inscriptions and archaeology. The amount documented by him was 50 feet. Now it's around 30 to 40 feet. And last time I documented, say 10 years back. This is in near Pandharpur, Middle Bhima Valley. And you can see how huge this is. These are the women who are carrying water and the people are staying above all this mound. And this is the southernmost extent of Deccan Chalcolithic. This is a site called Udchan in Gulbarga district on the Bhima banks in Karnataka, North Karnataka. This site was discovered by A. Sundara and a survey initiated by M.N. Deshpande. Actually, South India has a few other sites which have yielded Jorve ware, but there is also a very strong South Indian Neolithic component. So they are not totally kind of Deccan Chalcolithic sites like Vatgal or even up till T. Narsipur. We have got T. Narsipur. It was probably an import. There is only 1 or 2 shards of Jorve ware, but in Vatgal we have got them in profuse quantities along with South Indian Neolithic components. So these are mixed site. But however, at Udchan it is only and only Deccan Chalcolithic and the later periods. So now we try to understand the geography of Deccan in the lands and in the climate in which these people lived. There have never been very drastic environmental shifts in Deccan in last 4 millennia. There have been shifts in rainfall patterns and all, but there are no drastic shifts or there are no landscape changes. So when we see geography of Deccan, it is a semi-arid plateau area which is drained by Tapi, Godavari, Bhima and Krishna river systems. Apart from Tapi, which goes into the western seas, Godavari, Bhima and Krishna emerge. They originate in Sahyadri or western hills and they flow to eastern seas. The monsoons are highly variable. Deccan is known for a highly variable monsoons. Tapi has consistently good monsoons, around 1000 millimeter per year, but Godavari has 750, but still it has better monsoons, better soils. It becomes really very dicey when it comes to the Bhima Valley, where the monsoons are around 500 millimeter, that too very scarce and variable. In oral tradition, we say monsoons are bound to fail every 3 years. So this is a land of scarcity. And then soils also range from alluvial deposits to black cotton soils to thin shallow soils. Alluvial deposits are very narrow. There are black cotton soils occur in pockets. The deepest pockets along the Tapi and Bhima Valley and the southern Maharashtra is characterized by thin, shallow soils. So this is a kind of a soil map of Maharashtra where you can see all these rivers which are bordered with thin alluvium, and then there are a lot of these are just gray soils. This is black cotton soil, very fertile. These are stony soils but still arable, and these are totally stony tops which are good only for pastures and support the sheep goat pastoralism. We all know that now that it was not a Neolithic revolution but a gradual shift to the Neolithic ways or the farming ways. There was no revolution as such, and there are lots of cultural processes that are involved in the shift, gradual transition from Mesolithic or let's say the hunting gathering way to the farming way. However, in Deccan, we do not have even today a single site which has given us in its stratigraphy a very clear transitional record from Mesolithic to Chalcolithic. So we have to kind of conclude on the basis of the earliest sites that are available. Kauthe is one of the earliest site. We know that the earliest stimulus came from modern Gujarat. Tapi Valley is like borderline between Gujarat and Maharashtra. So the Songad Pass, late Harappan and Chalcolithic populations from Gujarat must have come there. That has been a traditional route of communication, and from there those wandering populations, probably the hunting gathering populations in North Deccan received, or the transfer of technology took place. There was, as earlier before we knew about the early sites in Tapi Valley, there was a hypothesis that this technique came from Malwa. So now we know it is from both the roots, from Malwa culture in central India, Chalcolithic, as well as from Gujarat, that we can trace the transfer of technology to the people of Deccan, Western Deccan. So far, 4 cultural phases have been identified. These are phases diagnosed on the basis of changing pottery styles, to be very honest, but that does not mean the shift or the change of people or popular ethnic identities. These are the kind of the material equipments keep changing, and that because they are easier for us to categorize and study in archaeology, we diagnose all these phases. Pottery becomes the most diagnostic material, as we all archaeologists know. The earliest phase is called Savarda, based on the first site that was discovered of this particular assemblage. Then next we do have a very distinct late Harappan phase. Then we have a Malwa phase, and then we have a Jorve phase, and that Jorve based on the type set Jorve, the first discovered site. And then we have 2 subdivisions, that is early Jorve and late Jorve, and the whole phenomenon spans from 2450 to 900 BCE. If you look at Savarda phase, it is restricted to essentially Tapi Valley and some parts, rather Daimabad of Godavari Valley. However, a few sites from Krishna Valley in Karnataka, North Karnataka, have also been reported by A. Sundara himself, and they are documented in the excavation of Terdal. Around 30 sites are known, majority located on Tapi and its distributaries, and the important site is Kauthe as well as Daimabad. Kauthe is essentially a pastoral camp which is seasonally occupied by multiple groups of people. So you don't really have a kind of a sedentary or semi-sedentary village that you letargate in Daimabad or in Amgaon. But very interestingly, at the same time, Daimabad has a settled site. We have a settlement when Kauthe has its seasonal camps. And the diagnostic ceramics are Savarda ware, which are very coarse, made on slow hill. They are not really fired very evenly. So you can see this is the gradual beginning of pyrotechnology or the pottery technology. They're slipped with a thick kind of coat. However, they're very distinct because they have the richest repertoire of designs. Later on, we see all the potteries will replicate mostly geometric designs, and then a very few here and there natural designs imported from nature or human and animal figures. However, Savarda has a wide repertoire of beautiful designs of arms, weapons, human and animal figures, plants, geometric designs, etc. If you see here, there are two peacocks and then there are antelopes. These are, I have got very grainy pictures from Savarda phase of Daimabad excavation. And these are the pit houses of seasonal houses of Kauthe people. Then we have a late Harappan phase, which is present only in Tapi Valley and Daimabad. It is very clear that there are certain groups of people from late Harappan sites of Gujarat that have actually migrated here. There are total 24 sites known, and from Daimabad we get a very interesting evidence of 4 sherds of Harappan graffiti, a sherd of perforated jar, which is a very diagnostic feature of Deccan Chalcolithic, 2 terracotta cylindrical seals with Harappan graffiti, and a circular seal with animal figure reported from Daimabad. So we know that they have, and then houses with mud bricks suddenly conform to 4 to 2 to 1 ratio. And we have very well made potteries, which have direct affinity with the late Harappan ceramic traditions or the late Harappan potteries made in Gujarat. And they are kind of intrusion. From Savarda, you suddenly go to the late Harappan, and then those forms do not continue after a few generations. We are going back to Malwa period. One more thing that has been ascribed to the late Harappan phase is a cache of bronze figures. In Daimabad, a farmer, while digging below a tree for some other purpose, found cache of 4 beautifully made bronze figures. There is a chariot pulled by a bull, a rhino, an elephant, and a water buffalo. Okay, and their stratigraphic location is not known, but they are extremely sophisticated, metallurgically made, and they have, looking at the connections with the animals that are depicted in Harappan art, these are almost unanimously understood by the scholars as late Harappan bronzes, and they were probably used in some kind of ritual processions. They do have wheels. So this is a rhino. This is a bull chariot. This photograph is immediately after the discovery, so you can see it is just a kind of a tarpaulin that they got for the background. And this is a water buffalo, and this is an elephant. All these bronzes are kept in National Museum in Delhi now. Then we have a Malwa phase. Now we see that there are sites unlike Savarda and late Harappa. Now the settlements have spread to the whole of the Western Deccan. Sites in Godavari and Bhima Valley are settled now, and the diagnostic ceramics is what we technically called Deccan Chalcolithic Malwa ware, because initially that was our reference point, Central Indian Chalcolithic culture, which has orangish pottery painted in beautiful black designs, and it does have some overall appearance semblance with those ceramics, so they were termed as Malwa ware and Malwa ceramics. But now we have understood this is a totally distinct category which has no connection, organic connection as such with the Central India. So these are some of the potteries. You can see some of the beautiful designs, geometric designs that are painted. Gone are the beautiful natural motifs that were found in Savarda phase. So these are the globular pots. There are a lot many bowls. There are handis that are found here, lotas. And then we come to the real efflorescence of Deccan Chalcolithic, that is called the Jorve phase. There is a sudden increase in settlements all over the Western Deccan. Earlier it was known as Jorve culture, how it has come and genesis and had become a major point, but we now know it's a gradual development within the Malwa culture, and there are very clear-cut continuities in the Malwa and Jorve ceramics. The highest number of sites are of this phase. Diagnostic ceramics are Jorve ware, and concave-shaped carinated bowls and spouted jars are the most distinct types. So you can see here, here's a complete pot. This picture courtesy to this is Dr. Padmakar Prabhune, a well-known numismatist who found it in Inamgaon on surface. Okay, so you can see an antelope painted here. And then there are, this is a concave carinated bowl, and this is a spouted jar, which are very famous in Jorve. These are some of the pictures from Inamgaon, and you can see this is a crucible for smelting copper, what in Marathi we called moose. And then there is a very interesting jar from Inamgaon. If you say we have an antelope figure here, and we have a very interesting figure, the only of its kind. This is an aerial view of the bullock cart. If you see, these are 2 bulls, draft bulls, and these are the 2 wheels, and this is the seating arrangement or the carrying structure. This is so much different than the Harappan carts that we know. And this is the only, it's very interesting, very clearly bullock cart was a very preferred mode of transportation. All the sites are located near perennial sources of water or arable land or good pastures. Okay, these are the kind of, this is the location logic for most of the sites or even the villages even today in land like Deccan. And some sites are located at strategic points such as passes. The most important site is called as Pimpaldara, near the village Pimpaldara at Bagalan Pass, which forms a very important communication route till today, till Pax Britannica between Tapi Valley and Godavari Valley. Most of the sites are very small, between 1 to 3 hectares, and the distribution varies across the sub-regions. Tapi has very dense clusters of sites, especially located on its tributaries, the south tributary zone, because the main Tapi river is known for its devastating flood. So there are not many rivers that are sites which are located on Tapi itself, but they are on the more perennial but more quieter sustaining rivers of south tributary zones that these sites you get. In Godavari, you have big sites located with some space, and in Bhima, we have small sites and very sparsely located. They are here and there scattered. So the distribution of site also differs over the region. If we look at the settlement, there is a certain kind of hierarchy that excavators and researchers have pointed out. They have seen that in every valley, the river valley, there is one very big village, and then there are sites of which are probably regional centers which are controlling small villages. And then there are certain sites which are either farmsteads or pastoral encampments or small camps for making tools, etc. So these are transient camps, but they must have been operated by people from village or the regional center, big villages themselves. So there is a kind of hierarchy. So the regional centers have been identified. This is a very processual structure of analysis, which we will come to in the last part, how they have come to this hierarchy. The Tapi Valley is Prakash, Godavari Valley, very obviously Daimabad, that is the largest site of all, and Bhima Valley, it has been Inamgaon. And then we come to the part of life ways. How did they live? We have taken a basic details now, and then we go to the actual way they live the life. Now, before I go to it, I would like to explain to the people who are not very familiar with the jargon or how archaeologists describe the evidence. What we are going to describe after this is kind of an evidence in a very compact way, but evidence of more than 1,000 years. And we are summarizing it. Okay, and moreover, this is a fragmented evidence of unknown whole. We will never get the complete whole. We don't know what we have got, some fragments of evidence, and we kind of try to interpret. We have a range of possible to probable interpretations, and we choose the best fitting interpretation to the available evidence, and therefore there are no final conclusions. They are bound to change with developments in the methodologies, advancement of theoretical approaches, and then the generation of new data sets, etc. Okay, and we are compressing 1,000 or 1,200 years into a few paragraphs. So there must have been smaller changes which right now, we are going to unable to identify in such a compact evidence. We start with the residential architecture or how their houses were. We see that they lived, most of the houses were either single roomed or double roomed. There were very few multi-room complexes. Almost all the houses had courtyards. So it's very clear that the nuclear family was kind of the norm. Okay, unlike what we say, the tradition of great Indian tradition of joint family. So that really doesn't hold true. The great joint family tradition is more more kind of suitable to the highly complex, big highly agrarian society. For the very small marginal societies, these small households or nuclear families are going to work out best. There are rectangular houses as well as round houses. Rectangular houses obviously dominate in the number, but round houses have been reported from a few sites, including the pit houses. Like they excavate small put potholes and pits, and then they construct the roof over it. So this is one of the modern houses documented by excavators of Inamgaon, but they are built in the same way, wattle and daub. In Marathi, what we say, kudacha bhinti. So you actually thatch some reeds and grasses with mud to erect the walls, and then you thatch it with another layer of grass. So if you can see here, the mud plaster has come off, and you can see actually the wattle inside. So these were the most of the Inamgaon houses were made of wattle and daub houses. These are the pit houses. Again from Inamgaon, you can see 38, 39. So there is a big pit, and then there are smaller pits. So maybe this was the residential pit, and these smaller pits acted as activity areas. And the big pit house would look like this. If you can say, they can save the they can gain the height by excavating. Today, the very poor families who are migrant laborers for sure cutting construct such houses because they are easier to make and easier and less costlier to make. So again, excavators have extrapolated that probably these houses were made by people who had lesser resource or resource poor people. We do not know. That has been a contentious issue. We will not really go into that right now. What was there in the house? When we see a house, a home, it is someone's home, and there are going to be bound homely possessions, what we use today. So what is there in the home? We can see there is a hearth or a fire pit. This is a we are going to get only the floor and some disturbed features in the home. Okay, so this is a fire pit or a chulha. And then there are storage facilities. There is a storage bin facility. There is a storage jar for pedestal. And then there is a saddle quern or the grinding stone that is used. So this is embedded in the floor itself. And then you have post holes where they must be erecting posts or the small wooden pillars to support the roof. And then there would be pots and lamps and as such small accessories which would be portable. These are the features of any household would commonly share from the Chalcolithic past. And then we come to this. It's a storage bin. There is one another story. We are recounting and revisiting stories today. So I would just make a diversion and tell a story about this. What happened is there were, you see, multiple storage facilities, obvious, very much needed in this semi-arid land. So excavators were getting just some platforms, clay platforms filled with sand, and they did not know what it was. And one day across the river, they had gone for some exploration. In a house in their village called Wangdari, they noticed similar clay platform and a bin atop it. When they inquired, they got the answer that these platforms were filled with acacia or babul ka ped, and acacia thorns and sand to prevent it from rodents. Okay, so probably the same technology was being used by the Chalcolithic farmers. The acacia thorns being kind of biodegradable, they must have perished, and now only the sand is kind of remaining. So this was kind of explanation that this is the kind of technology that was used and that has continued in the region. One more storage facility is a pit silo, or you excavate a pit and plaster it with lime to protect it from pests and rodents, and then you actually protect it with a kind of a roof, and you can see one of the pit silos in Inamgaon. There were no roads as such. There is no house planning. The houses are just not haphazardly, but unplanned, and the spaces in between must have been used as roads. And here you can see one multi-room structures. It has 1, 2, 3 houses, 3 structures, 3 rooms in one structure, and then there is this one room house. Then there are certain pit silos. Okay, and then there are small round houses. So there is a kind of variety in the residential architecture. In between, that was Malwa, this is Jorwe. So you can see a small round house existing along with a rectangular house which has a room which is partitioned. In one hall, one part you can see fireplace, 2 fireplaces, and then there is a sort of courtyard in house here in front of the room 76. The courtyards are always marked by the plastered floor. And then there is a house in Savarda phase in Daimabad where you actually see a joint family. There is one house, but in every room there you have a fire pit. In every house there is a fire pit. But so there will be probably 2 or 3 families or units of within the same family subunits staying together. There is a non-residential architecture as well. There is a public granary at Inamgaon, one of the most important archaeological evidence that helps us arriving at certain social and political structure conclusions about these societies, about that later. But in early Jorwe period, we get 2 independent rooms partitioned by storage bin platforms, and there are mud platforms for bins, there are pit silos and huge fire pits. And this whole thing is situated at the back of a multi-room complex. So this is a public granary because it is not directly attached to any house. This is the public granary. This is the multi-room complex, and at the back of it, you can see this public granary. This is the actual photo while taken while excavation was going on. You can see these pit silos, and these are the platforms, and there are lots of post holes that are seen here. The other public architecture documented from Inamgaon is ditch. A defense wall was documented with bastions at Daimabad, and an embankment, which was a kind of diversionary canal for flood waters, was also documented from Inamgaon, and which must have served as a water storage as well as the excess flood waters. And it was probably the reason why it was one of the mainstay of the wheat cultivation that we suddenly start getting in early Jorwe period, when the paleoclimate data tells us that there were good rains. We also have a small jetty and a paved road section in Daimabad. Otherwise, we do not have any roads. So only in Daimabad we have almost 5 feet wide and 36 to 40 feet long street made of paved with stones and potsherds. It must be having some kind of significance, but right now we are unaware of that meaning. Then we come to the another aspect of it, that is burials. Unlike the modern Indian society where most cities cremate their dead, these communities interred or they buried their dead within the settlements, often the burials are often associated with the courtyards and occupational floors. Most of the burials are infant burials. There are not many adult burials. So maybe the adults were given some other treatment, we do not know. We have different types of burials. We have just extended skeleton. Like today we give burials in other religions, in Islamic, and you just extend the skeleton in a sleeping position and you inter it. And then there is one very typical way of burying, that is a single or twin urn burial. Urn is a big clay pot and they are kept mouth to mouth, and it creates an enclosed space like a coffin, and the skeleton is kept inside. Okay, so that method is generally used in most of the sub-adults or the children's cases. The grave goods used to be kept there, and most of the times the feet are chopped off. It must be having some belief associated with either when you are either burying them in your houses, associated with houses, so it becomes a part of identity. So maybe that the soul should not go away, or there can be an alternative explanation that soul should not come back to the living world. So there are 2 possible explanations. The feet are chopped off. This is how mouth-to-mouth urn burial looks like. This particular burial tradition is also found in South India, so it is very clear that excavators said that this has initially come with the contact with South Indian populations from Karnataka. So this is one more twin urn burial from Inamgaon. And then there is a very different and rare burial. If you can see, this is actually the 4-legged storage jar that is used as a kind of a chair, and a skeleton was kept here in a sitting position without feet being chopped off. So we knew that skeleton had certain social standing. We will come to that in the later parts. 2 or 3 such burials were found from successive levels of the same house or the same multi-room complex, which was situated near the public granary in early Jorwe. The daily accessories of people. Today we can't move without gadgets, so they also had their gadgets. Okay, apart from the pots and pans and lamps, which are the essential utilities, they also had their tool kits. Their toolkits were made of stone, bone, and metal. Copper was quite precious, so you have very few metal implements compared to the stone ones. And copper does not have that hardness which will later the steel iron will give you. So obviously their stone will be used more for the hunting purpose. So you have micro, very small blade tools, the blade component dominates necklace. You also have ornaments. You have necklaces of beads made of stones, made of terracotta, made of copper, etc. You have bangles, you have rings of shells, semi-precious stones, etc. There are lots of varieties that are documented across all the sites. So here is just, these are very big lamps. Okay, this scale is of 5 centimeters. So you can see these are very big lamps. We have also got oil seeds. So we know there must be some kind of fuel that would be keeping the wick burning in these lamps. And then we come to economy. When we speak about economy, there are certain components of the economy. One is subsistence activities, the activities which sustain the life of people. Then there is a craft production and technology. And then there are two aspects which are very inherent to the sustenance of the small marginal populations, and that those are mobility and exchange. We go to subsistence activity. We know that these are the subsistence economies. See, these villages are existing before the advent of urbanism in this area. There are no urban centers, there are no cities. Okay, so there are no secondary and tertiary activities. You are producing for your own wants and consuming it. So you have farming, but as we all know, whoever are aware with the most of the peninsular India, only farming is not going to give you the whole sustenance of the life. You have to diversify, you have to keep animals, you have to do some hunting gathering, the traditional till Pax Britannica, or even after that when we see the colonial records and before, you see how people were living across the land, and they are exploiting all the types of strategies. Obviously gradually the agriculture or farming gets more cultural primacy, but that's another issue, and that needs a different kind of explanation, and that will take evidence from 2 millennia. But here we see farming, animal husbandry, and hunting gathering all are being employed by these people. We have variety of cereals, cereal grains, pulses, legumes, millets, etc. Almost the whole package that we see today in the traditional peninsular Indian agriculture of farming is present there. They had both winter and summer crops, that is Kharif and Rabi. The cereals include wheat, barley, rice. The legumes, millets include Italian millet, sorghum, pearl millet, kodam millet. The legumes and pulses include lentil, horse gram is kurit, lentil is masoor, green gram, that is moong, black gram, that is urad, Bengal gram, that is chana, grass pea, pigeon pea is tuar or arhar, hyacinth bean, what we in Marathi call wal, even today a very popular legume that is considered by as delicacy by many of the communities. We also have oil seeds like linseed, sesame, and safflower in the crops. And it is very evident from early Jorved, looking at the crop calendar, Professor Kajale has inferred that double cropping system has started. It has been initiated by the farmers, and that's why we have such plethora of crops that are coming in from early Jorved onwards. At the same time, we have a variety of animals that are being kept or domesticated. There are cattle, buffalo, sheep, goat, pig, donkey, horse, dog. There is also cat in some of the sites, very naturally with rodents and agriculture production and snakes. The cats will be petted. And then there is fowl. The horse comes only very late in the last levels of Inamgaon, so that is not present in all the Chalcolithic site. That's a kind of an exception which is at the fag end of the Inamgaon. And these are some of the agricultural implements that have been documented from Inamgaon and Walki. Walki was a farmstead of Inamgaon. We'll come to that very soon. This is one kind of a hosher like thing, a plowshare, and this is made from the scapula or the shoulder bone of a bullock or cow. It's a bovine shoulder scapula that is used for making this particular implement. Then you have actually the antlers that are used as small plowshares, probably. They are from Valki. And then you have a hollow antler, which is kind of seed drill, where while plowing you put the seal from this tube so that it is sown in a line. So these kind of implements, the seed drills, are even employed even today by the traditional agricultural practices. So we have a probable antecedent or the most oldest ancestor of all these seed drills employed in Deccan. If you look at their diet, apart from these crops that I mentioned, and apart from these wild domesticated animals, we also have wild animals that are hunted. When it comes to diet, we know based on the bones which are charred, which are cut for the bone marrow, and the kind of age that is animals are being slaughtered, and the minimum number of animals that are counted by archaeozoologists like P.K. Thomas and Professor Joglekar, that beef was their staple diet. Beef and around all these vegetarian products, or these are crop products, must have also kind of apart from beef, they also ate sheep and goat. The hunted animals include a variety, almost 12 or 13 species of deer. There is wild boar, mongoose, porcupine, hare, panther, tiger, wildcats, wolf, jackal, squirrel, monitor lizard. There is aquatic or water animals like crocodile, turtle, fish, crabs, and then there are birds like geese, heron, Indian bustard, peacock. Okay, so they are kind of utilizing whatever resources that are available surrounding their settlements. In the fruits, we see that they are also collecting fruits of jamun, bear, amla, wild dates, and kadappan almonds. Kadappan almonds is what in Hindi you call chironji, or in Marathi we call it charoli, which is now used kind of in some sweet delicacies. So these all are being used. Obviously, they are not cultivated deliberately as we do today, but they are resourced from their surroundings. A very good site catchment analysis exercises have been done in case of Inamgaon by Inamgaon, and then by R.S. Pappu, and then also in case of Daimabad by Shinde and Pappu. But right now, we are not going into those details. We don't have much time. I understand I am expanding a little more bit than the given time. We come to crafts. Very obviously, these craft specializations do not mean full-time craft specialization, as we saw in the Harappan civilization, where there are specialized villages or specialized sites which are producing, say, hundreds and hundreds and thousands of shell bangles, or copper implements, or copper ingots are found. So nothing is happening here. What we see are essentially part-time craft specialization. There are going to be a few people who are part-time. They are essentially farmers and engage in subsistence activities, but they are also making some crafts. They are also making some things because the demand is not going to be much. These are very small populations. They include pottery, lime, copper objects making, stone tool making, and bead manufacturing. Stone tool making is only one craft which is being practiced by all the households. So nobody is dependent on other for the kind of regular toolkits. They are making it their own required. But other things they seem to have been taking more skills, and there are only one or two households or structures which give us, along with the residential. So it's in the house itself. There are no different separate workshops. The people are making it side by side as they live. You have these different activities like lime making, pot making, copper smelting, and bead manufacturing, shell bangle making going on. This is one of the kiln or the pottery firing kiln that has been documented by Inamgaon. 3 or 4 were documented in successive levels, and this is an extremely scientifically built kiln with passages to let out hot air, passages which will even for fuels, and then there are clay cushions to spread the heat evenly, etc., etc. This whole kiln has been cut and transported and preserved in Deccan College Museum. We all can go and see whenever we visit the museum, and most of us must have seen that. This is one more kiln which from later Malwa levels, which was kind of demolished after documenting. So it has also the similar structure as the later earlier kiln which I showed you. This is a crucible. made of terracotta, and there are copper tongs. Obviously, this was used for smelting the copper. And these are some of the copper implements. You can see this is a copper bangle, copper bead necklace, and then there is a copper adze, and these are stone axes, ground stone axes from Deccan Chalcolithic, which are preserved there in the main gallery of Deccan College Museum. Then we come to the economy. Mobility and diversification are integral strategies when one is living in the milieu of scarcity and variability. You don't know next year monsoons are going to be enough or not. You don't produce that kind of a surplus. You can't go out to any shop for buying surplus. So what do? They practice mobility. They try to use resources from across the landscape. So they must have practiced transhumance as the like today Dhangars do, as evidence of sheep and goat might reflect. Okay, we also have farmsteads. Inamgaon has yielded a small site nearby Valki, which is clearly a farmstead and had seasonal occupation. And X-ray diffraction analysis showed that Inamgaon and Valki ceramics came from the same source. They are the same pottery. So most probably groups, some people from Inamgaon, a group maybe from each familiar household or maybe a few household would go to Valki, which is situated in a very pocket of a deep fertile soils of confluence of rivers. It is near modern Ranjangaon, and then they would use it, and then they would transport the produce back. Small sites, there are many small sites in Tapi Valley documented by Professor Shinde, which are only pottery scatters and which are annually submerged in the monsoonal floods. This is very interesting. This is not an evidence which most of the people discuss while discussing economy of Deccan Chalcolithic, but I find it very interesting because that clearly shows the kind of seasonal nature of those settlements. Okay, so it is one really needs to understand that mobility need not always be it's these are very small, and most of these indications, small indications, are not always available, does not make us discount the presence of mobility. This is the site of Valki, plan of structures in Valki. All are round houses which are seasonally occupied. Only one rectangular house is there, which was probably looking at the evidence, they said it was not a residential but probably a storage room kind of. And this site was excavated. From 95% of the site was excavated. So we have one of the most complete data sets coming from any site possible in Deccan Chalcolithic. So this was a farmstead of Inamgaon. So maybe other sites also had their such seasonal campsteads. And then we come to economy of exchange. We very well know, looking at the repertoire or the material possessions of these people, that they are participating in the exchange network with various lands or various regions in India. The very word copper, chalco, copper is not native to Maharashtra or Deccan. That has to be imported in, and the most known source was obviously the Khetri mines of Rajasthan, which also supplied copper to the rest of Chalcolithic and Harappan sites. Then we also have various other things. In coming from Rajasthan, it's not only copper. We have specific shells which are used, Turbinella pyrum, they are called, used for shell bangle making. They come from the coast of Gujarat. And we also have certain things coming from central India, Karnataka. There is stone, there is lapis lazuli, there is stones like serpentine, which is available only in Karnataka. There is gold, which was probably coming from the Kolar or Hatti mines. Okay, so there are small non-local items which tell us the kind of the glimpse about a very robust exchange network, which is kind of visualized in the book First Farmers of India by Professor Dhaulikar. So this is Inamgaon, this is Karnataka, and how they are they are interacting with all these lands. Obviously, this was not a trade. It was not a monetized trade, but it was exchange which must have been carried through cultural means like transhumance, like religious gatherings or ritual gatherings or social gatherings that must have occurred, social interactions which are kind of facilitated. Even in traditional Indian things, it's always religious festivals which are kind of major economy churner. So we look at exchange as a very economic thing. It's not economic, it's cultural and social in a more way. Apart from the non-local items, there were also a few non-local items. Inamgaon there were probably pottery and agricultural products that were also exchanged on shorter levels. as we always seen the pottery from Walki. So maybe the small sites around Inamgaon were also getting pottery from big sites, from Inamgaon, from Daimabad. And then there is one very interesting bit of evidence from Inamgaon. It has 3 grains of rice and evidence for hyacinth bean. Now, 3 grains of rice indicate that it is not native. Had they cultivated rice, you would have got more rice. Rice and hyacinth bean are specifically products of higher rainfall area, and Inamgaon is not within such higher rainfall area. So they must have come from sites which are on higher altitude, or they are in higher rainfall zone. The most known site is Chandoli, which is in a higher rainfall zone. So from such sites, these small products must have come. They are very easy to miss, but apart from the non-local or luxury items, as we see, these utilitarian items must have also exchanged within the communities. There is one more aspect which is very, very rarely discussed. We know we have got the evidence of marine fish from Inamgaon, and the excavators say that it's 100 kilometers as the crow flies from the western coast, and there is Sahyadri mountains in between. So how does one in Konkan, how does one get those commodities from the coast? From Konkan, we do not know any protohistoric site till date. It's only recently now that we know some prehistoric, or let's say pre-early historic drawings or etchings in carvings in rock, but they do not have very clear-cut archaeological dating available right now. But there is a kind of available data which is kind of forgotten or shadowed, and they are the cave sites. There are 3 or 4 cave sites known from Western Ghats, and we can link up those sites with Deccan Chalcolithic probably. There are caves at Pachad, Hathkhamba, Gargoti, and Malangini. Malangini is in Goa. Hathkhamba is near Ratnagiri. Pachad is a very well-known place near fort of Raigad, which was the capital of Shivaji, and Pachad was the residential place of his mother Jizabai, and the Gargoti near Fort Bhudargarh near Kolhapur. Okay, all these caves have been surveyed and excavated, and these are the caves. If you see, this is Pachad, this is Chandoli, Inamgaon, and Daimabad. This is Pachad, this is Hathkhamba, this is Gargoti, and this is Malangini. Pachad, Hathkhamba, and Malangini have been excavated, and they have kind of yielded microliths, some rolled unidentified potteries, and their dates coincide. Their dates do not come from the pottery but other ecofactual remains, and they are not very precise, but they come somewhere near or kind of concurrent or contemporary to the protohistoric period or Deccan Chalcolithic period. There are non-local items like quartzite stones, chalcedony from Hathkhamba cave. So they're not there. So it's very clear they're participating in some kind of exchange. And these sites continue even later, because you have got some eroded iron artifacts from Malangini as well as Pachad. And Malangini caves is excavated. Goite is a very less known cave, but it's a wonderful work by Gudalar and Korisettar sir and others. So one needs to investigate more in these connections with Konkan, because in Daimabad we have a very interesting paleobotanical evidence, and that is of a plant called Pavonia odorata. That is its Latin name, and it is known as Sugandha Bela in Marathi, and it has certain medicinal properties. It was discovered in adjacent parts of the ritual complex in Daimabad, and it is native to Konkan only. Okay, so it is something very tantalizing to see how it is occurring in what context. The context is not clear, but it is tempting enough for us to associate probably with ritual, and it is a non-local item, and which does not have any dietary or utilitarian use, but it is coming very clearly from Konkan. So these connections need to be investigated more when we speak about the exchange networks of Deccan Chalcolithic, where the focus has always been with the rest of the Neolithic and Chalcolithic cultures. Then we come to their belief systems. Not much is known about it. We know that they believed in life after death, because the kind of intramural burials that are being found, the feet are being chopped off, so they had certain ideas about it. There probably mother goddess believed. There were certain mother goddesses found with it, and the most famous example is this headless goddess found in a clay box, unbaked clay box, along with a bull, and if you insert a stick, it can kind of, she mounts the bull. We do not know the meaning of this. There was no residential house or any other context that could really that can corroborate any other possible interpretation. Excavator Professor Dhaulikar and R.C. Dhere, one stellar scholar of Indian religion, they had tried to identify the goddess Vishira from Mahabharata. Vishira is the headless one. But personally, I feel that is a bit far-fetched, because we really do not have any cultural or organically established connections with these communities, and the later writings of Mahabharata that are coming in. We know Mahabharata is a text in making for 1,000 years, so we do not really kind of chronologically connect these two pieces of evidence. Then we also have a storage jar with a thereoanthropic, half human, half animal figure, and that half panther and half human figure. If you can see here, there is a standing man, the torso is of man, and the rest of it is the spotted panther. The jar is kept, it's a huge storage handmade jar from Jorve levels in Inamgaon, kept in the Deccan College Museum currently. So we know there was some kind of probably shamanistic beliefs that are being practiced. It has no known connection with the rituals or the form of religion that we practice anywhere today, because there is a clear-cut discontinuity between these practices. We haven't been able to identify. There is no point in just making a far-fetched statement. The day we can make connection, that would be a wonderful day. But till now, we know this is a kind of a tribal shamanistic religion. One more, but most important, comes from ritual complexes in successive levels from Malwa period onwards in a kind of adjacent areas in Daimabad. We see a structure here which is enclosed by 4 walls. There are small structures here, and then is a kind of repeated building of small hearth in different directions, and then there is a step like Chandrashila, which is plastered with lime, and it marks the kind of threshold. And there are no thresholds in any other houses known from all the 300-400 houses from Deccan Chalkritic. This is the only house which is a kind of a enclosed, walled enclosed complex of 3-4 structures. And then there are lots of small miniature pots filled with burnt grains and all. They could have been refused, they could have been not. It is very difficult to understand, because as we know, archaeological evidence is a palimpsest. It's a kind of compressed, half erased, half done, mixed evidences from across the millennia. But very clearly, this is a kind of a ritual or a ritual complex related to their belief systems. And this continues the same area here or around here. It continues to house ritual complexes from Malwa and all the phases, successive phases within early Zorwe in Daimabad. It seems Daimabad really was a kind of a Mohenjo-daro of Deccan Chalcolithic. And then we go to the social political structure. It's very clear that these are pre-state tribal societies, or what in anthropology we say middle range societies, neither very simple hunting gathering social bands nor the complex social family structures that emerge with the urban civilization. These are in between middle range pre-state societies. The general markers to understand the social and political structures are architecture and burials, and a kind of, if there are presence of non-local items and the distribution across the households, etc. Okay, what is evident here is that there are varieties in the families or households in the evidence. We see 1 rooms, 2 rooms, 4 rooms, but all the structures are kind of evenly spaced. There are no separate clusters which would say a kind of different groups of communities within it or different classes within it. There are no kind of separation of houses. Okay, they all are similar in nature. They are using the same construction material, only their sizes differ. There are, in all the levels, there is in Inamgaon, there is only 1 multi-room complex, but rest of them are, the multi-room complex also is using the same kind. They have same household accessories, same construction material. So that would be rather a heterogeneity, case of social heterogeneity, familiar household heterogeneity, rather than inequality, because inequality is differential access to the resources, but it is not the case here. So otherwise, the best house would have the kind of non-local items, some made imported from outside to make the house, that becomes a status thing. Here there are no status differentiating markers in the houses. Looking at the burials, there are, all the burials are same except those two to three burials which I talked about. Here there is a picture. You can see here is a 4-legged clay storage jar which is used like a chair, and the person who is seated there with crossed legs, his feet not chopped off. And this is a kind of a photo with his historical value. If you see Professor Shinde, Professor Dhaulikar, and this is, I think he's Mr. Rasar, the draftsman. I'm not very sure. The face is not visible, and they are excavating this important burial, or the burial similar to this. So they are the excavators. The excavators of Inamgaon were Professor Dhaulikar and Ansari, and it was initiated by Professor Sankalia. Dhaulikar and Ansari being the best excavators in India that time, and the excavations have kind of documented all the minute pieces of evidences. Going back to these burials, so these are the only burials coming from same house in successive levels. So based on this and some other markers, Professor Dhaulikar said that this is a chiefdom society where a chief is elected, and maybe for a few generations he might be kind of inherited, they might inherit a title, but it's not a class-based society but a chiefdom society. This analysis was based on a celebrated article by Peebles and Kuss about some archaeological correlates of ranked societies. That article has been criticized rightly later by Thomas Pocketart and others. And the chiefdom analysis has really moved, archaeological analysis has moved beyond this typical evolutionary or processual templates of chiefdoms of 1970s and 80s, but still it is a very useful term or category to describe this kind of nascent or societies' transient political structures. And yes, Inamgaon does kind of classify on that level, and it is very clear anthropologically looking that middle range societies would operate within, generally operate within a template of or the framework of chiefdom. So here we have that evidence of this, and then the other evidence that they speak about is regional site hierarchy. As I told you that regional site hierarchy was proposed by the excavators of Inamgaon looking at this Peebles and Kuss model. There is a public architecture which has to be organized by the chief. There is a differentiated burial, yes, and then there is a part-time craft specialization, and then there is a public storage place. All these kind of markers which are described by Peebles and Kuss are directly applicable to Inamgaon. So obviously these kind of explanations, processual explanations, were provided in 1980s. And then we come to the beginning of the end. I have very rapidly and kind of briefly taken overview of their lifestyle, but some aberration is taking place at around 1000 or 1200 BCE. Something curious thing is happening. People are noting that settlements in Tapi and Godavari valleys have been abandoned around 1000 1200 BCE. In excavations of Prakash and Nevasa, excavators found a sterile layer, a hiatus, a gap between the settlement histories or the strata layers of Chalcolithic and early historic period. So it was very clear that settlements are not having a break after the end of Chalcolithic. So as early as 1974, Professor Dhaulikar, in a celebrated seminar, Radiocarbon and Archaeology, of proceedings of which are available, he proposed his hypothesis that probably because of the environmental aridity, people abandoned their settlements and moved towards Bhima Valley. This was a contentious proposal even then. Noted prehistorian R.V. Joshi had countered that this has always documented in the proceedings, that why would they move to Bhima Valley, which is more arid. This is more, it has more harsher climate. So but that environmental explanation had arrived on the scene from 1974. By that time, Inamgaon had started being excavated, and the upper levels of Inamgaon kind of yielded unforeseen or hitherto not seen cultural assemblage from Jorwe, which was later known as late Jorwe, the late phase of Jorwe culture, which was discovered only at the Inamgaon first. And here it seemed the settlement have survived a little longer, but there is a complete change in the cultural equipments or the cultural material that we are getting. Looking at the paleoclimate evidence, the excavators have, based on the Rajasthan paleoclimate evidence coming from the lake or playa sediments and sand dune sediments, the paleoclimatologists had stated that around 1000 BCE, there is an arid phase for 400-500 years. Okay, so that kind of taken in note by the excavators, because what they were getting is change in house shapes. Now, apart from the round houses, they had round houses suddenly go down in number, and rectangular house and round house becomes a dominant form. The pottery becomes coarser, paintings disappear. Okay, and what we know as Late Jorve, which has been documented by A. Sundara from his Karnataka sites, that was the Late Jorve pottery, as was evident through the Late Jorve excavation of Inamgaon. The crop package has changed. Wheat, rice, they are no more in the scene. Crops like barley, okay, or ragi, which have shorter crop cycles, which are very hardy for storage, which are very good for storage, are dominating the crop pattern. There is a change in diet. The staple becomes black buck. The hunted animals occupy. The sheep goat pastoralism, sheep goat numbers go up, surpassing the cattle number. Okay, so there is an overall change in the most aspects or life ways of the Inamgaon people. So this is the what known as Late Jorve phase and found in Bhima Valley. The other sites known of Late Jorve phase based on the ceramic evidence are Songaon and Khed. Songaon was also excavated prior to Inamgaon, but it was a brief excavation, and so they were not really aware. There is early phase also and late phase also. Late Jorve was not really differently studied. There is a site of Khed which is unexcavated. Then Naik and Mishra's survey of 1997 has documented 11 sites, and A. Sundara's site has surveys had already documented many sites, and then my survey in Middle Bhima Valley also documented 8 sites apart from the 4 earlier known sites. All the sites have yielded early Jorve as well as late Jorve ceramics. So it's not that these are the Inamgaon the only site. So this is how the late Jorve, we will come to this problem later. This is how a late Jorve house typically looks like in Inamgaon. You can see it's haphazardly round. There are certain cultural equipments. These are the saddle cones, and there is a burial in it. Gwen Robbins has noted how empty houses are being used for burials. There is a haphazardly made hearth here. Okay, and then there are 4. So this house has been used and reused. This is not evidence in a single deposition. These are quite 2 or 3 episodes of deposition that have happened, but every time these are the kind of seasonal things. The excavators have noted the seasonal nature of the houses, that they have said that these groups, the people were kind of seasonally occupying the sites. Looking at the paleoclimatic evidence, excavators hypothesized that because of the increasing environmental aridity, it became impossible after some time to carry out farming operations. So farming dwindled, and ultimately semi-sedentary or sedentary communities were forced to choose nomadic ways of life, of nomadic pastoralism, and that's why they became a kind of nomadic herders who kept coming to the site for a few years or few decades or of some centuries, and then they also stopped, and Inamgaon was finally abandoned, never to be resettled again. Even now it is an abandoned site. You look at the pottery now. Here the pottery is these are the Late Jorve potteries. You can see there are less. This is the black and red ware, that is a new ceramic industry that is coming in. There are certain bull figurines which have been found from early Jorve and others. These bull figurines are a hallmark of all Chalcolithic cultures, in Western and Central India, and they must have occupied the kind of a male principle according to the researchers. So Inamgaon and Deccan Chalcolithic are also not an exception to this, but we are looking at the Late Jorve pottery right now. And then one more very interesting evidence from near Inamgaon, this is called a place called Pimpalsuti. It's just 6 kilometers away from Inamgaon, which has got small stone circle burials like megalithic. We do not know any megalithic burials in the mainland Western Deccan. This is only an exception where you can see there are no huge stones but small stone circle, and in the midst of it at the center there was a burial in megalithic fashion but with late Jorwe cultural equipment. You can see this is a very typical spouted late Jorwe unpainted jar, spouted jar here. Okay, so this is how the last surviving settlement of Inamgaon ends, with people probably opting for nomadic pastoralism as per the excavators, Professor Dhaulikar, excavators and others, especially Professor Dhaulikar. And this has been a bone of contention or contentious issue for later researchers. There was a very good exercise. Sheena Panja has done a very interesting critique of methodologies and kind of approaches that are used in Dhaulikar's Inamgaon analysis, and she has shown her interpretation is that there is an inherent mobility right from the beginning. It was never a sedentary village, but these were always a kind of semi-sedentary groups who were multiple groups using the site, and at the end phase, the people are changing the function of the site. So, and there are multiple groups using things for using the structures for multiple reasons across the time. That's why, but ultimately she also ends that these people stopped the use of this site. Then there are also, based on the skeletal remains, there is a biodemographic model proposed by Gwen Robbins that the collapse of agriculture leads to the poorer health. Unlike what Walimba and Vikas said, that they noticed certain good health improvement parameters in late Jorwe, she kind of studied the stature and overall pathology of all the skeletons, and she says that the collapse of all the entrenched system of agriculture, of farming, suddenly leads to the situation where the society can't cope, leads to the poorer health, and there is a change in demographic dynamics which ultimately forces people to abandon the site. However, all these explanations have a limitation. That is, all the discourse, the whole discourse is focusing on Inamgaon evidence, or at the most Upper Bhima Valley evidence. And Deccan Chalcolithic is a much larger phenomenon than that. What happens to the rest of the sites? Do we really go from one explanation of one site applying to all the sites across all these hundreds of kilometers from North Deccan to South Deccan? I was never sure about that. So I felt the need to generate fresh data set. And that's how I surveyed the middle reaches of Bhima between the Lake Jorwe sites documented by A. Sundara in the lower reaches of Bhima and the upper Bhima. I thought that would be the most productive kind of region. So I have surveyed middle Bhima Valley, and I have documented more than 186 sites ranging from Mesolithic to late medieval. However, there are only 8 late Jorwe or Chalcolithic sites, plus 4 already known, so total 12 sites, in contrast to the almost 82 sites known from early history. Okay, so this is something there, and all the sites yield very meager amounts of late Jorwe as compared to the early historic ceramics, or even meager amount of early Jorwe. So these are very small sites probably, but it is very difficult to say looking at the disturbance of the site through the human agency. All sites are multicultural. Late Jorwe culture is just a part one of the cultural chronology. And then I worked in a site called Dhulkhed, which was documented by Sundara in his survey, and then later also visited and commented upon by Professor Padayya. It's a small village, and where an ash mound was, here is the ash mound, which is a characteristic feature of southern Neolithic, was documented with Deccan Chalcolithic pottery by the researchers. So they had documented that this is the Chalcolithic ash mound. When I visited the site, I realized it's not only the ash mound, but the whole village is located atop a huge habitation mound yielding from evidence from Chalcolithic to straight away late medieval or early modern even today. The village is now abandoned after the Killari Latur earthquake, and they have resettled nearby. But this has a continuous occupational evidence from proto-history to today. So this is actually, that was just a part. The whole site has a settlement and an ash mound with it, which was not earlier documented in Deccan Chalcolithic. So this is more, the site morphology is more akin to the South Indian Neolithic, where ash mounds are associated with habitation sites. Okay, I took a small, this is the ash mound which is now converted with, there is a legend of Daksha Yajna and it is converted into a sacred shrine today. And you just dig by hand and you get this ashy material and you get a lot of cattle bones and Deccan Chalcolithic pottery here. You can very clearly see these bones coming in. And they say that this is a very sacred place where Daksha performed his yajna and Sati committed suicide. And therefore, the Shiva, deity Shiva, destroyed the whole place and burned down the whole place. I took a very small section there in the settlement, which is abandoned, and I tried to find out if there is any stratigraphic relation that can be found between early Jorve, late Jorve, and early historic. Unfortunately, no, they are just succeeding each other. There are certain episodes of very ash burning. There is a petrified layers of ashes, cow dung ash, as they are evident in other South Indian Neolithic ash mounds. But there is no break or there is no clear-cut relation between late Jorve and early historic. There is no hiatus, and this evidence is somewhat similar to the vertical excavation where Schaefer, Corisetter, and his team, and Patil also, they document that late Jorve ceramics and early historic, they're coming from the kind of same depositional context. They say that we need to really work out the chronologies in these micro pockets of regions, because they are not like any other Deccan Chalcolithic chronology that we know, and Dhulkhed has also yielded a similar kind of chronology. And then in 2014, I conducted a small brief survey in relation to the 12th century, 13th century copper plate. I was actually trying to survey the villages that are mentioned there and the landscape details that are mentioned, which are rarely mentioned in Deccan plates, Maharashtra plates, but it was there, so I was doing that. And while doing it, this is near Kolhapur. You can see this is the region. So this is extremely fertile region of Krishna Valley, and which has perennial rivers, extremely deep fertile soils, and very congenial high rainfall. This is not the area of drought and famine. And from here, in 3 sites, Mangle, Chikurde, and Devarde, I documented late Jorve sherds. These are the first known late Jorve sherds from outside the Bhima Valley context. In Apegaon excavation, Professor Dev does mention late Jorve sherds, but they are neither described nor documented photographically. So we really do not know what kind of sherds or what kind of ceramics he's speaking about. But these are very clearly late Jorve sherds, if you see, and this is one Malwa sherd also that came from the village of Mangle. So one really needs to understand a kind of, we need to expand our surveys, because in this whole region, the Karad and Upper Krishna Valley has not been very systematically, intensively surveyed, and this whole central part of Maharashtra and North Karnataka has not at all been systematically surveyed with focus on Chalcolithic ceramics. So we really have a kind of incomplete data. We just know a small site called Tulzapur Gadhi, which is on the cusp of Vidarbha Chalcolithic and Deccan Chalcolithic, and we are still not very clear about the relations between these two Chalcolithic phenomena. Vidarbha Chalcolithic is in itself a separate identity, but we really do not know the interconnections between them. So how does one really add up these figures and add up this data? But before that, we come to the aftermath in a chronological sense. What happens after Deccan Chalcolithic in Deccan? Well, there doesn't seem to be any protohistoric Iron Age. There are no megalithic burials or megalithic communities that have been documented from the mainland Western Deccan. It is very interesting. The area near Kolhapur, I'll just go back to show from where. So from here, this area, which is adjacent to the North Karnataka area, there are a few from Gadhinglas area and west of Kolhapur area. There are a few megalithic burials that have been documented since 1950s and 60s, but only in this area, and they're very clearly an extension of the megalithic size that you find in all this Belgaum and north of Belgaum area. But apart from that, and Pimpalsuti, which is kind of a stone circle burial, but no iron implements. Okay, so there is no protohistoric Iron Age, even after searching for all this Middle Bhima Valley, I have not come across. There are surveys, very good surveys of early historic sites from Terna Valley, as well as Upper Krishna Valley by Niranjan Kulkarni and Amol Kulkarni, but they are also not mentioning any proto-historic iron sites. So it's very interesting. So there is a kind of a Chalcolithic, there is some kind of a break probably, and then there is early historic just before Satavahanas. So there might probably there was a hiatus at least in some settlement histories. We do not know if all, because that will need a more intensive exploration. It's the major sites. It is true that major sites were never resettled. Neither Inamgaon nor Daimabad has ever been settled afterwards. These have been abandoned mounds till they were excavated by the settlers. Inamgaon comes from its name comes from Inamgaon, that is a village that has been gifted. Inam is a gift, and that is populated. That land was given to people say 300 years ago, and that village is 5 kilometers away. So these sites have never been resettled. And then we go to the last part. I would like to say it's kind of with the new data that we are having, I'm trying to counter, it's not in counter, but a question, the stereotypical template of Deccan Chalcolithic culture, which was given after Inamgaon excavation, very justly so, because that was the kind of widest known data set we had very thoroughly collected. So the excavators wrote, Professor Dhaulikar, my guru here, wrote a book called First Farmers of the Deccan, but kind of this has persisted in creating in stereotypical template. Especially one is that all the Chalcolithic cultures are single culture sites, but no, my survey tells me, or the even having a re-examination of earlier material, that most of the sites are part of the multicultural chronologies. They have it's Chalcolithic is not the single. Inamgaon and Daimabad and Songaon are kind of exceptions. Even Jorwe is said to be a single culture, but it is not. If you look at the report very clear, very minutely, you see some early historic potteries being photographed and documented in its pages. Obviously, by that time, the indices, ceramic indices of those periods had not been very clearly understood. So you cannot really talk about it, but we need to relook at it. And Jorwe is also mentioned 8th century copper plate at Juyarave Nagar, Ashwi copper plate. So it is not that maybe the habitation has shifted or they excavated a part which was a Chalcolithic settlement, but no, Jorwe was never a single culture site. So are all the sites in Middle Bhima Valley. We know Apegaon, Paithan, Nasik are not single culture sites. Okay, so only a few sites which are exception. Another is nucleated villages, a kind of, we said nucleated villages, but looking at Dhulkhed, we know that across this whole span of 1500 years and hundreds of kilometers across almost the whole Maharashtra, western and central Maharashtra, the life histories of settlements are bound to differ, and they must have had a different kind of archaeological morphologies of the settlements also. Dhulkhed has already shown us, so maybe the sites in north will have more kind of varieties, and there will be cultural boundaries. Okay, cultural boundaries are archaeological cultural boundaries, not ethnic boundaries. So these are expected in such a vast data set, but kind of we look at it as just in a template of nucleated rural settlements in the hierarchy of regional centers, villages, and their farmsteads. We need to think out of the box now, and for that we also need to generate fresh data set. When we speak about end, Inamgaon has been an exemplary work. Even the post-Inamgaon research is very kind of constructive. But it's again, I'm talking about, this is telling us what Inamgaon, or at the best Upper Bhima Valley sites are responding to the changing circumstances. The Krishna Valley tells us there are also Ledgerway sites. That means we need to explore more regions to understand the actual spread of Ledgerway settlement, and then only we can speak about whether one explanation befits all. That is actually the whole thing. This is not a monolithic phenomenon. We don't expect it to be. So a monolithic explanation will not serve the explanation of culture change at the end of it, or the end of Chalcolithic settlements. Okay, we have to remember that Inamgaon excavators are proposing a hypothesis. They are not giving you a final conclusion. And then I come to the last part, legacy. What is the legacy of Chalcolithic settlements? They seem to have vanished. and there is no connection. So why does one really look into it? But they lay the foundation of early historical Deccan. Even the settlement histories might have discontinued. The crafts like shell working, lime making, metal smelting, they persist. Even in early historic, you have the same craft. So the craft knowledge of technological knowledge has been carried by the intervening generations even after the possible abandonment of the settlements. All the early historical trade centers have invariably Chalcolithic background. Even today, as I told you, even Ter has one late Harappan shirt documented by its one of the excavators. So we expect that to be so. The trade routes had precursors in Deccan Chalcolithic exchange networks. I have already explained about Konkan, and later on we have all these passes and cave sites being used. We know there are so many cave sites like Naneghat. They are on the Konkan and Sahyadri crest. So these and these caves have themselves some iron implements, etc. So these need to be looked into. Again, sites like Bagalan Pass, Pimpaldara site at Bagalan Pass and others, and trade centers, one realizes that these communication routes or exchange routes would later develop into the routes for carrying out trade, which prospered in Mediterranean as known as in Satavahan times, and we know as Indo-Roman or Mediterranean trade. And third very important thing is the cropping practices. Today, what we know as traditional Maharashtrian or Deccan diet, I wouldn't say Maharashtrian because North Karnataka also has a similar diet of pulses, legumes, and the things are kind of directly inherited from these the crops that we see. Almost same things we eat: masoor, chana, udad, moog, jawar, bajra, ragi. All the same things are still part of our traditional dietary pattern, and it's very interesting because it's truly a global package. These all this crop package, if you really trace the origins, they are mix of West Asian, African millets, coming from East Europe or China origins, or coming from Gangetic Valley and Odisha. Dorian Fuller has very thoroughly documented their origins. So you see, this is a kind of a end product of a globalized process that took place in prehistoric times, that helped us evolve a local, now what we can call ethnic local package of dietary practice. So that starts with a globalized process. They are actually the two ends of the same spectrum. And in the last, how Chalcolithic survives in memories. We look at the texts, and there is a text called Bhima Mahatmya, which is an unpublished Sanskrit text, probably from somewhere between early medieval and medieval, composed in Sanskrit. And that is celebrating Dhulkhed as one of the most important place of pilgrimage. It is a Tirtha Kshetra. It's a sacred place because it has an ash mound, and it is ascribing the legend of Daksha Yajna to it. And that is the oral legend as well. The local oral explanation for the villagers is the same. So that has been documented in Bhima Mahatmya. I have worked on it in a separate paper, and they are preserving the memories. They're explaining it differently, but kind of these cultural relics are seen, and they are being internalized in the by the later communities through maybe different heuristic devices, but they are being preserved. Same with a small site of Mungi, which is not very properly documented in excavation, but that was excavated along with Paitan in Godavari Valley. And that site again is mentioned in Gautami Mahatmya. Gautami is the Sanskritized name of Godavari, as a site of big sacrifice of Brahma. So one really needs to look into the local Sthala Puranas or the local religious texts or secular text to understand how people have looked in their landscape. These become the part of the landscape, and they are internalized by the later cultural milieu. And then for oral traditions, there are other things, but I think I have gone very late, so I'll just end with one last story. I have taken a lot of time. So I end with the story. I started with Jorve. That is a story by someone else, and now I end with the story documented by Inamgaon excavators, Professor Dhaulikar and Professor Ansari, and that again ends with Inamgaon. This is a small shrine on the Mound 5 of Inamgaon. That's a late Jorve. It's a Mound 5. There are small 5 parts of the Mound 5 that is called Mound 5. It is kind of filled almost exclusively late Jorve material. So there is this shrine there, and if you see, there are votive bulls that have been donated or that have been votive bulls have been kept there deposited by people. When excavators observe, they realize there are groups of people, they intermittently come to the site, visit the site, deposit the bulls, perform their small puja-like rituals and go away. And they have no relation with Inamgaon population, the village near or any other village nearby. They are totally different communities. So they inquired. And then these people who used to come there, they said, we are Gopal Bhillas. It is one of the communities. Now Bhilla has become a kind of very generic and broad term, but they call themselves Gopal Bhilla, rather Gopals. And they say this is, according to their oral tradition, this is the place from where their ancestors came. This is the place of their ancestors. And that's why it is mandatory for them to visit this shrine once in a year, anytime in a year when they can, and perform and remember their ancestors. This is a small votive deposition that they do. I want to end it here. Let this story, you think about this story, because I have seen oral histories being preserved for 1200 years, 1300 years with properly document I could in my field. So I totally don't totally discount this oral history as well, but one needs to work on it, how these memories are created, because they might not be one-to-one historically accurate. But yes, this is one most tantalizing story that I have heard or read about Deccan Chalcolithic. And on this note, I end it here. And thanks a lot to all of you. And thanks a lot to Adventures in Archaeology for giving me this opportunity to speak about Deccan Chalcolithic in front of you people. And I hope everybody is taking care of their health. Stay home, stay safe, and stay tuned to Adventures in Archaeology. They are coming up with many far more interesting lectures in their course of lectures. Thank you all.